For over 15 years, I've looked at the relationships between digital media producers in Ghana's diaspora and tech entrepreneurs in the homeland. I describe myself as a media anthropologist, a cultural studies, digital ethnographer. And in that time and where we're at right now, sorry, this is my website. You can read more about my work and the fields that I'm coming from: new media studies, where I had a graduate fellowship at UC Berkeley, and in the Department of African Diaspora Studies, where I received my PhD in the same institution. Right. So it's impossible to think about new directions for development in our current moment. While we've been theorizing the era of the post-aid era for nearly a decade or more, the end of USAID and the US withdrawal from the WHO, among other things, have made this once speculative policy position a stark reality. My work in Ghana since 2009, or with Ghanaians since 2009, has shown that the people of the global South, young people, set to be part of the population bulge in Africa, where 25% of the people under the age of 25% of the people in the world will be under the age of 25, will reside in Africa in just a few short years. These young people that I'm showing in this image here and the work they're doing, I call them activist developers. They have been preparing for this moment for some time. They've been living it, mobilizing citizen-led tech interventions to get people to vote, to give people digital literacy, works against what anthropologist Brian Larkin describes as the default position of the post-colonial African infrastructure and government accountability, malfunction. The term he uses is the ecology of breakdown. As my interlocutors in Ghana describe it, they say we have to move beyond the state. I'll read from my book. So since 2012, I started to interact with tech developers, programmers, people who labeled themselves social entrepreneurs, some of them working out of co-working spaces and tech hubs in Accra. And I'll read a little bit here. Reiterating a comment that I heard from other activist developers who ran their own businesses in Accra, Kumasi, and elsewhere, the Impact Hub's operations manager, Victor Kalechi Ofoebu, who joined a discussion I was having with the director of the Impact Hub. Almost anything you do in this ecosystem will have deep social and economic impact. We're in post-colonial Africa. GDP is stagnant. Daily wages rarely peak above $2, said Ofoebu, a longtime resident of Ghana whose family is originally from Nigeria. Nothing works the way it should. Schools don't serve us, government are absent, and the infrastructure is failing. Startups are stepping into the void to solve these problems. His collaborator, William Senyo, the director of Impact Hub, later echoed his statement: nothing the government does can contribute to innovation. When they tried with education by laying universal rather than local standards, squash is what he makes a hand, he squashes his hand and makes a flattening gesture. Negativity, he says. We are terrible in science, technology, and mathematics. The government wants us to create data centers. Amazon Web Services, more than enough for me. How is that a strategy for national development? Moderating just a bit, Ofoebu chimed in, but we can't just innovate our way out of this. So the concerns around being an activist developer, engaging with communities, citizens, and the government in both technological ways and in political ways has become the core of what the young people I documented in their work between 2011 and let's say 2016, continuing on 2018, have been doing for years. Again, anticipating this era of post-aid, anticipating the neoliberal turn in politics and adjusting with their own tactics, their own vision of how businesses, local enterprises, and tech developers can disrupt this network society. Now, when I often talk to people about these kind of ventures happening on the continent, when I talk about images of young African developers using drones for telemedicine, or the impact of mobile money, digital wallets, these figures are a little old, but they represent a continuing trend where Africa, or the sub-Saharan region particularly, is the most dominant region with bankless digital wallets, mobile money, right? And has been going on almost a decade now. So when I describe Africa as leading the world in a mobile-first internet ecology, having the fastest growing market for mobile internet devices annually for the last 20 years, where bankless digital money transfers happen more frequently than anywhere else in the world, most people revert to a kind of simplistic, if you will, phraseology. They say, are you talking about Wakanda, right? This level of innovation that's happening on the continent, this sounds like Black Panther. Right? And while I love Black Panther, I think it's immensely aspiring. This rhetoric continues throughout the discourse around technology on the African continent. So much so, the professor Clapperton Mavunga, brilliant scholar of technology and ethnohistory, says that this Africa is rising narrative is all over the web, all too often under the name of Afrofuturism. Taken to its most literal sort of extreme, I'm going to play a short clip from the African Diaspora Development Institute, started by Arikana Chihombori Kwao, former African Union ambassador to the UN, where the image of Wakanda is being invoked quite explicitly.
Welcome to African Diaspora Development Institute, an institute that is designed to be the bridge between the African diaspora and the motherland, Africa. We're looking forward to an amazing 2021 where we have many projects that are laid out for you. Our blueprint is very clear in terms of what we would like to see accomplished this coming year. Of course, our flagship program is going to be the Wakanda City of Return, which is going to be built in our beloved city of Cape Coast in Ghana. That is going to be the shining city on the hill. The city that's going to stand up and look across the Atlantic and remind the slavers that while you may have won for over 400 years, the children of Africa are back home, back to that piece of land their ancestors last set foot on the beloved continent of Africa. The children of Africa, descendants of the formerly enslaved, are going to come back home to Cape Coast. That is where we are going to converge and look the slavers in the face and say, you may have won for over 400 years, but ultimately we are the victors. Wakanda City of Return, Cape Coast, Ghana. Please go to our website, learn more about it. Another exciting project that
we see, this image of Wakanda is even rife in the development and advocacy literature and movements. There's at least one project that's labeled Wakanda 1 or Wakanda City. This is in Cape Coast, again, a historic city or site for transatlantic encounters. Former colonial capital for the British and a key site for the transatlantic slave trade. These schematics here show the vision for a futuristic port and commercial development and residential area that will take place in Ghana, that will take place in Cape Coast. As of 2026, that project is on hold, but we can see this vision of Wakanda and Afrofuturism being very much connected to visions of freedom and autonomy in current activist work. Of course, this builds on a long tradition of innovation in Ghana and the African continent. We could critique the way futurism indexes something yet to come, a prediction, something that's not yet a reality, when the kinds of on-the-ground revolutionary changes in internet and telecommunications have already taken place over the last 20 years on the continent. Africa, north and south, east and west, went from having some of the lowest density of telephone and telegraph wires in the 1980s to the fastest growth in mobile phone consumption year to year since 2006. This concept is often described as leapfrog innovation, which has largely not borne out in the development literature, except for in the use of mobile internet and mobile communications. It's not the future, it's already happened. It's mobile internet and phones have transformed Africa today. This combination of Pan-African zeal, harnessing the capacities for ICT for development, encompass what I've come to describe Pan-African futurism in the work of activists, engineers, and artists, and the digital diaspora from Ghana and Africa broadly. What distinguishes this ethos and aesthetic from earlier modes of state-level modernization and industrial development is its decidedly neoliberal focus, its focus on development outside of the capacities of the state, and the notion of being a disruptive tech entrepreneur or community builder. So we have a legacy of STEM being part of national development strategies. Here, the Okosombo Dam, hydroelectric dam in Ghana, built in 1965, started at the end of British colonialism and completed during Nkrumah's presidency. We also have other projects around science, cultivating and using science to advance the economy, to advance energy independence in Ghana. This is the Atomic Energy Commission, which ran a nuclear reactor and research reactor, has run one since the 1950s, or 1960s, I should say. Right? And of course, across the continent, there are many other examples. This one quite interesting of a partnership between the German missile company or satellite company, ORTAG, and Mobutu Sese Seko in Zaire. Again, Pan-African futurism that's taking place now, as opposed to a African futurism or Afrofuturistic, speculative imaginary about what is to come, harnessed the tangible ways that innovators on the continent are using technology for liberation in our time. There's a sense of collective unity that runs through the work of tech developers, software engineers, social entrepreneurs, who are focused on redeeming the continent, right? Tying back to Pan-African ideals of unity and liberation and freedom. So ITC is seen as a means of advancing African sovereignty. I think this is complementary to the notions of Afrofuturism and African futurism rather than competing. The distinction being that these projects are focused on tangible projects happening right now. Across the 7 chapters, I use the notion of Pan-African futurism to tie in a related set of practices and ideas. In the first chapter, I describe how colonialism continues in the digital age, and Africa's position in the network society remains subaltern. The capacity of the African internet is at best a quarter of the capacity of the internet and external connections to the internet in Europe or North America. And I'll show you some slides to that illustrate that. In response, what many of the developers have to respond to are conditions of, as I've said, breakdown, electricity shortages, internet itinerancy, lack of digital media and equipment, right? Also biases and practices of digital redlining, in which activist developers, entrepreneurs cannot get access to equipment because Visa or Amazon has essentially redlined many parts of the continent and made delivery of ICT inaccessible, amongst other, let's say, financial transactions and procurement of goods. Another tactic to overcome this network asymmetry that I describe in the book is called digital diaspora. Not simply the virtual community of Ghanaians or Africans online, but the practices that energize these social ties in this social network across diaspora sites, sites like Ghana Web, or let's say social media, innovative use of social media on WhatsApp. Apps that haven't really circulated outside of into the West, such as Viber at the time. I document a number of these practices, what's called tactical mediation, attempts to create or energize a network in this asymmetrical network. The production of these together has produced what I call the Afropolitan mediascape, or the African mediascape, in which we can experience Nollywood, Gollywood, Afrobeats, and other circulations, media circulations within this network and these ties that are created. And finally, in the last chapter, is a bit of an ode to George Padmore and his notion of Pan-Africanism or communism, the book, and talking about the capacity for entrepreneurship to be a liberating practice. It's a question, right? So it's a deep dive into the notion of Afrocapitalism, which is described as capitalism with an African soul or an African ethos, focused on social wealth, problematically focused on social wealth. I'm going to read just a little bit more about the work of activist developers from the book. Introduction, Disrupting the Network Society. Accra, 2019, the year of return. In 2019, Ghanaian President Nana Akufo-Addo initiated a national tourism campaign labeled the Year of Return, enticing Afro-descendants of slavery to explore their roots on the continent. Concerts, heritage festivals were held all year long, with social media posts attesting to pilgrimages by Black American celebrities. Essence magazine hosted a full circle version of its lucrative annual music festival in Accra for the first time. The annual number of foreign visas to Ghana rose to 800,000 that year, an increase of as much as 10%. In a spectacular moment in December, a group of more than 140 African American and Caribbean expats received citizenship in a ceremony hosted by the Ghanaian president. In an effort to engender racial solidarity and increase investment from Blacks living abroad, the government-sponsored event was a spectacle of traditional robes and new names to go with the new passports. On behalf of the government and people of Ghana, I congratulate you on resuming your identity as Ghanaians. Akwaba, you are welcome, said Nana Akufo-Addo from the Jubilee House, the country's presidential residence. A few weeks earlier, down the road at the Accra International Conference Center, the German software firm SAP and the American social media network LinkedIn were involved in a different kind of cultural exchange. Speakers gave rapid-fire talks on launching startups, and entertained pitches from aspiring entrepreneurs at the second annual Ghana Tech Summit. Ato Uzin Appiah, an electrical engineer educated at MIT and Stanford, discussed his work with Ghana Think Incorporated, a nonprofit that's been networking software developers and young professionals for monthly meetups around the country for more than 10 years. Recalling the achievements of the Nkrumah era's Akosombo Dam and the Ghana Atomic Energy Commission, he exhorted the many students, startups, and entrepreneurs at the networking conference to live up to the mission of his organization's decidedly Pan-Africanist objectives. He said, "Our goal is to build a critical mass of patriotic, passionate, positive, proactive, progressive programmers who will build a bright future for all of Africa." Technology marks both a problem and its solution. This book describes how tech users with roots in Ghana, West Africa, deploy information and communications technology to overcome the problem of disjuncture between the West and the global South. More than a digital divide in usage and awareness of technology, Africa has been linked asymmetrically to the global internet since its inception in the 1990s. As of 2024, the African continent had nearly 1/4 the internet bandwidth and capacity of either Europe or North America. African countries dominate the United Nations annual list of least connected countries, in which internet is most expensive and access is often inconsistent. Now, the good story is that Ghana, the nation known as Africa's Black Star, in part for its economic development success and democratic stability, has been a notable exception. The West African Republic has been among Africa's earliest adopters of the TCP/IP protocol, aka the internet, in 1995. Today, Ghana is among the most highly connected sub-Saharan African countries, with 6 landing stations for crucial undersea fiber optic cables, enabling transnational digital communications. Connectivity has enabled exchange between Ghanaians and Ghanaians living in diaspora and digital access to the broader world. Yet while mobile phone penetration rates reach well past 60% in this country of 30 million people, I think there's more now, only about 40% of Ghanaians have access to robust internet. This disjuncture exacerbates conditions of alienation between homeland and diaspora and extends a system of unequal relations between Africa and the West set in motion at the dawn of colonialism. The experience of internet and its promises of a more democratic, quote, network society or egalitarian network society remains deeply uneven in Ghana. The solution to this disjuncture for the media activists and software developers I document in this book has been not simply to embrace the transformative affordances of ICT as promised by a neoliberal world economy. Rather, with a sense of Pan-African futurism, the developers documented in this book hold to a liberating vision of one destiny connecting by connecting through digital media to advance Ghana and all Africans' technical and political autonomy. It's hard to read and hold the book at the same time, sorry. So I'm just gonna flip through a few more slides. This is a map that I often use from the firm Telegeography. The colorful lines here show the major underwater sea fiber optic cables that connect over 80%, nearly 90% of all internet connections. Ghana is there, circled in red. But the African continent in general, you can see, has very few lines around this, right? Comparative to the connections between North America and Europe, and also North America and Asia. This is a heat map of what internet access looks like provided by the International Telecommunications Union, the division of ICT research of the United Nations. Again, Ghana's not doing bad, but particularly in Central Africa, there's a tremendous underserving of the 1.5 billion people compared to the rest of the globe. Into the void to disrupt this network society are activist developers. You know, and often I'm asked, well, using ICT to transform development or to transform life conditions on the ground in Africa, maybe that's just a buzzword, right? Maybe that's just opportunism. amongst the developer community, the international development community. But having participated in this social space and in Ghana's developer culture for over 10 years, nearly 15 years, what I see is a robust and consistent commitment to national development at an almost ideological level. Often when developers like Atul Uzin Appiah talk about their work, they frame it within Africa's rise, within Africa's achievement and Africa's autonomy. They're not simply focused on what's happening in Ghana or what's happening in West Africa. They see innovation, workarounds, collaborations with diaspora, use of open source digital tools and media as a means to overcome systemic and enduring post-colonial neocolonialism, let's say. And in many ways, this aligns with the key ideals of the Sustainable Development Goals. Here's an image of an activist developer at an elections observatory in 2016. Fred here on the left is donating his time and volunteering to spread information over Facebook and over social media about the election results. He's been an active member in this group called Ghana Decides. He's also a fintech entrepreneur who has a microfinance enterprise and ran it for several years. Here we see an example of some of the social media and apps that have been influential in transforming transparency in Ghana. The app and company Odekro operated for about 5 years, documenting the voting records of parliamentarians in Ghana. And in the book, I talk about a relationship that I had with one of those developers. So again, across these 7 chapters, I'm talking about not only activist development, but the experience of digital diaspora. On the left here is an image from Ghana Fest, an annual Ghanaian homecoming festival that has been taking place in Washington Park in the south side of Chicago for over 30 years. In 2020, during the pandemic, we went from an embodied event, as you can see, elders in one particular community doing libations as they tour throughout what's called the Durbar. In 2020, the event became virtual, with live feeds being broadcast between Takoradi, Accra, Chicago, onto a number of websites, including Facebook, Instagram, and an venture that developed called Diaspora TV. There was live performances, there was cooking classes, and there were several concerts and speeches. For me, we took this physical event that brought people together in diaspora, from diaspora around the Midwest, the largest homecoming festival in the United States for Ghanaians, and put it online. As many as 800 people participated that day. And to document the event, myself and my 2 research assistants had about 10 screens between us, mobile phones, multiple laptops, screen capture. We were interacting with people on Facebook, on Instagram. Compared to, let's say, being at Ghana Fest itself in Washington Park, where we might be interviewing people, we might be observing performances or walking through the market area. This event online was just as physical and just as embodied. After 4.5 hours of documenting this event, I was sweaty, I was exhausted, I was mentally taxed, right? So my level of digital embodiment was quite extreme in that event. And for its participants, they were also very active. After the ceremonies, there was a DJ who was broadcasting onto Facebook and onto Instagram. And many of the participants living in Chicago, living in Ghana, participated at the same time setting up their camera phones or computers in their homes, dancing, showing the footage in their backyards, and talking to each other across the screens. It was a real moment where digital diaspora wasn't just a website, it was a cultural event. So through these tactics, this is a bit of a screen capture you can see of Twitter interactions. We can see that diaspora as a practice, digital diaspora, and a community of practice has the capacity for real-time and multi-sided sociality, right? And an embodied reality as well. Okay, in closing for the first part of this talk, I just want again to point to the deep connections between Ghana as a diaspora homeland, as a Pan-African republic, and the historical or enduring vision of enterprise and material wealth being wrapped up into these liberation efforts. The Black Star, which is the central feature of Ghana's flag, harkens to Marcus Garvey's symbol of the Black Star, the name for his shipping line, which was said to be one of the main commercial vehicles for the United Negro Improvement Association during the 1920s, the largest Black political organization in the country, in the United States and in the Atlantic world, to become self-sufficient and empowered. Right? Ultimately, the Black Star Line failed, but the symbol of the Black Star became central to Ghana's flag. And Nkrumah was well familiar with the UNIA, having attended speeches in Philadelphia while he was a student at the HBCU, Lincoln University. And the term Black Star Line continued in Ghana's republic as the national shipping company for several decades. Okay, so I could continue to, I guess I'm going to wrap up some bottom lines here. The paradox of ICT, or technology for development. Some of the key questions coming out of this research. I thought I was done with this project in 2018. The story of digital diaspora work, the story of activist developers coming together, disrupting the network, that seemed to me to be the main story. Along came the pandemic, and while I saw more interesting iterations of both use of technology, what emerged was the question around development and development politics. Using ICT as a main indicator of development, or using it as a tool for development, begs the question of development itself. What do we mean? Do we mean modernization? Do we mean westernization? Do we mean the improvement of life incomes, and on what terms and what costs? Autonomy, as envisioned by the activist developers and by many Pan-Africanists, requires, in this day and age, global and regional integrations. A neoliberal model of development often usurps national development goals, particularly as the IMF and World Bank are main drivers of this kind of development. And as I argue in the book and talk about in the book, when Ghana's neoliberal president met up with activist developers and came into conflicts with them, ultimately, what was the outcome was a crackdown in democratic expression, freedom, that followed many of the challenges of the pandemic, right? So that a developmental state model in which the government determines the main objectives of development, even technocratically or even technologically, as in the case of Singapore and other places, does not always align with democratic or libertarian outcomes. So that's part of the paradox here. Technology and development are ultimately political. Technology needs an ethos. And in Ghana and other parts of Africa, that ethos is Pan-Africanism, or what I call Pan-African Futurism. Through digital diaspora, Ghana's disparate diasporas, both its Black diaspora, historic Black diaspora, and contemporary diasporas, have formed are communicating within the African mediascape. And this innovation is very culturally and contextually specific, right? I try to document that in my book, the way tech developers have to iterate internet and digital connections in order to develop software and solutions, and in which they take already existing tools such as WhatsApp and create very interesting things such as online markets. But innovation is not enough, again. To transform the condition of a subaltern or global South state in this era of global connections in this world system ultimately is a political question. Technology is not enough, right? It needs an ethos. And the ethos that I saw reflected in this work is Pan-African Futurism. Thank you very much.
Just want to thank you again for the book and for the talk. It was really a great, great opportunity reading this. And thanks to Buffett for overlooking my manifest lack of qualifications to be talking about tech entrepreneurs. So I'm a historian of Ghana, which is about as close as I get to any kind of relevant knowledge to this topic. But you know, I particularly loved the book both for its kind of theoretical framing and the richness of the empirical chapters. And I think one of the things that it really helped me understand was the way in which the kind of inherently future-oriented nature of Pan-Africanism kind of ends up reinforcing or having, you know, creating an affinity with the you know, kind of techno-futurism and the way that techno-futurism's kind of, you know, implicit promise of radical transformation ends up then giving it a kind of affinity with Pan-Africanism. And so the kind of the way in which they, you know, may not immediately seem to be kind of obvious partners, you know, you really kind of helped me understand those deeper connections. And also the way in which the kind of enticing nature of that coupling, particularly kind of for the entrepreneurs that you worked with, can sometimes paper over a lot of really complex contradictions. And so I guess I wanted mostly to ask about some of those contradictions and giving you an opportunity to talk more about them, many of which you alluded to in your talk, and, you know, some of which are more or less explicit in the book itself. And the one that maybe is most explicit is this kind of tension between Afrocapitalism and Pan-African Futurism. And I guess one of the things that sort of struck me about that was, on the one hand, it's not surprising, right, that for these young entrepreneurs, that becomes, you know, sort of entrepreneurialism and the market become these really seductive ways of thinking about transformation, you know, both because of the failures of dead aid, right, which is now dead, and then the kind of failures of post-independent socialist projects, you know, not to mention kind of the sort of omnipresent rhetoric of, you know, there is no alternative, right, and sort of, you know, the kind of neoliberal hegemony. But the thing that still kind of surprises me about that is the way in which it reflects a certain kind of narrowing of the imagination, right? Which is by no means, of course, unique to Ghana. I mean, the kind of young people in this country similarly, right, sort of have that sort of narrowness of imagination. But there's a kind of irony in a futuristic project, right, that seems to not be able to think beyond kind of current orthodoxies, right, of sort of economic transformation. And particularly given how powerful West African science fiction has been, right, and sort of imagining really radical kind of alternative futures, the way in which there's something kind of deeply conservative, right, about the kind of entrepreneurial culture of this kind of version of futurism just sort of struck me. So I guess I would just, you know, like to hear sort of more from you, kind of your thinking about the sort of tensions between Afrocapitalism and Pan-African futurism. The second kind of tension, which is maybe you gesture to in the book, but don't maybe make quite as explicit, is this kind of paradox of a Ghana-centric Pan-Africanism, right? And the way in which Ghana has this sort of persistent exceptionalist narrative, right? Going back to, you know, maybe Paisley Hayford 100 years plus, through Nkrumah, through Panifest, and through the contemporary moment. And the way in which kind of Ghana always has this ability to kind of take very local concerns and very local resources and use them to craft an imagination that's supposed to be Pan-African. And so what is kind of the tension in terms of thinking through Pan-Africanism from this one very specific place that in many ways is highly exceptional, as you've kind of shown us, right? And then maybe the third would be, and this is where kind of as a historian, the book really sort of opened my eyes to a lot of things. And one of those is that so much of this rhetoric rests on a kind of implicit reimagining of the history of colonialism. And to imagine the history of colonialism as the colonial state as inherently anti-entrepreneurial, right? So that entrepreneurialism can be configured as inherently anti-colonial, right? From including that sort of video clip that you gave us, and thinking about, say, maybe Moses Achonu's edited volume as kind of a high example of this, right? Where, you know, entrepreneurial projects that may be sponsored by, supported by, planned out by, and celebrated by colonial officials for colonial purposes are reimagined as anti-colonial, liberatory projects. And so how much kind of are losing sight of the way in which the colonial project itself sort of fetishized entrepreneurialism. We've come to think of it so much as sort of a developmentalist state. But of course, the sort of thinness of administrative presence always meant, at least in sort of West Africa, and sort of non-settler colonies in West Africa, so much kind of colonial energy, particularly in Ghana, right, went into sort of fostering and enabling entrepreneurialism. And sort of how much then a kind of forgetting of the colonial roots of a certain entrepreneurial thinking underpins the idea of entrepreneurialism as inherently anti-colonial and sort of Pan-African. And so I guess, again, just sort of curious as to sort of where you see maybe the historical consciousness of some of this thinking about Pan-Africanism. Matt had another question that I sort of mentioned that, about kind of where we are today, but you sort of mentioned that you've kind of, as many of us do, right, gotten a little bit fed up with the topic after writing the book, and maybe don't want to kind of think about where we are in 2025, or 2026 now. But kind of where I found myself thinking at the end was, okay, now with both the failures of the Akufo-Addo administration, right, and the kind of collapse of support for that kind of neoliberal project in Ghana, along with kind of growing awareness of sort of techno-dystopia, and particularly on the continent, right, where we know so much more now about the ways in which people on the continent have been used to do everything from sort of content moderation and social media and AI, and kind of exposing themselves to incredible abuse, and kind of the lawsuits against the major tech companies for that kind of psychological exploitation. Whether there's been any kind of rethinking of that utopianism on the part of the entrepreneurs that you were working with. So it's a lot of questions, and we probably don't want to try to engage all of them, but just to kind of throw those out, and then whatever of those seem interesting to you, and then whatever comes out of the audience.
Yeah,
so.
Thanks, Sean. Thanks for those thematic points. Very strong thematic points of departure for a conversation about where did this sit now, and the kind of evolution of this stuff. And thanks again for being here. I really appreciate your work as an Africanist and somebody who is attentive to Ghana historically. It's great to be here with you and hang out with you again. What I would say is, in 2011, when I first went to Ghana, the activist developers, the change agents, the ones running social enterprises, were very idealistic and very much buying into, as I describe in the book, the California ideology, right? That the state, that infrastructures, hierarchical infrastructures of the industrial age are going to be radically transformed by digital media, by the internet. And if the state represents that hegemonic standpoint, that one route to political participation, one route to visibility and wealth is through tech entrepreneurship, right? And then framing that entrepreneurship as having social outcomes or social objectives very much was a part of the rhetoric of that early era of tech development, and an opportunity for transformation on the ground in Ghana and Africa in general. Over the course of, let's say, 5 years or so, as these developers were part of civil society campaigns, as they began to interact with the government in different ways, sometimes being co-opted or hired into political parties. The discourse around disruption definitely lessened, right? And some of the more experienced community organizers and activists and NGO workers who are based on the continent began to temper their optimism about being able to transform society so rapidly through technology. And it's what required, as when I talk about the impact hub in the book and what I was mentioning just before, they're clear-eyed about the challenges, infrastructural challenges of doing innovation in Ghana and in Africa in general. So some of them started to moderate, saying we have to work collaboratively with the system. And these were never hackers, right? These weren't people who were doing denial of service attacks on any agency they liked, right? They were already embedded with a kind of reformist agenda rather than a radical revolutionary agenda that you see in the work of, let's say, Anonymous or Wikipedia, WikiLeaks, other kind of insurgent tech activism in the West. They were very much about reforming the state. And as they began to interact with the state and reform it and see the challenges, the hard work that takes, they would either temper their enthusiasm, be absorbed into the political organizations, or further alienate themselves out of this, right? And think about, for instance, diaspora networks or traveling abroad as ways to strengthen political positions in the country itself. So there was a maturing. Now, there are always new developers, somebody who's learned code new, somebody who's came up with a great app idea, somebody who has a new idea about accountability and visibility. That is generationally. And what we see with those individuals, there's spaces for them to walk into because of the work that the early activist developers have done, people like Herman Chinnery Hess, Soft Tribe, even the busy internet. Those of you who've been to Ghana might know that space, right? So we have waves of different entrepreneurs, social entrepreneurs, activist developers who wind up having their different experiences. You also have people who are, interested in crypto and sim spoofing and developing, an enterprise, a business. Some of the developers I talked to at some point were saying, well, I'm developing this app. It's for really the American market, and at some point when we get rich, we'll accommodate to the African market, right? Those are not the people who I focus on as having a Pan-Africanist disposition, right? Not only were there concerns of activist developers around Ghana's development, Ghana's regeneration or renewal, or transform the economy in Ghana, but in very many ways they had to be Pan-Africanists in a geographic sense. Many of them had companies or enterprises that were in Guinea or in Nigeria. You had Cameroon developers living in Ghana, learning software development there, and devising strategies, regional strategies, right? So at two levels, one, success required a regional thinking. Two, because of those successes and because of the culture of Pan-Africanism endemic to Ghana, the developers there tended to see their projects as extending beyond Ghana, right? And certainly there was a lot of diaspora input, but they saw the impact of their different projects being manifested in different places. And certainly there are some ties where it says a voter quench campaign in Nigeria in the early 2005, 2006, mirrored the Ghana Decides campaign. And as the activists became more savvy with things like hashtags like Dumso or Fix the Country, these things began to piggyback off of things like Roads Must Fall in South Africa, or NSARS, Bring Back Our Girls, all these kind of hashtag movements associated with youth activism, technology, and media, and in the current moment with the Gen Z protests across the continent, right? So there's a continuity, and in many ways, the vehicle or the means of getting past the state, getting past the limitations of the national borders and national boundary, overcoming the neo-colonial infrastructure, was to think in Pan-Africanist terms. I do think that allowed a lot of play with the concept of Pan-Africanism, right? And while I think there's a productive narrative and discourse I talk about in the book, lowercase p Pan-Africanism as being, let's say, the everyday cross-continental, cross-cultural expressions, experiences that continental Africans experience, right? There's also a kind of co-optation of the concept. So if you hear something like, for instance, a Pan-African fintech firm or a Pan-African medical services company or a Pan-African crypto exchange, right? Some of those things are not necessarily both liberatory or concerned with advancing social wealth, right? They're advancing a kind of extraction and scarcity form of capitalism, right? And so those forms of Pan-Africanism, that discourse around Pan-Africanism, I think is disingenuous. So for me, that's the tension in the Afro-capitalist discourse. The Afro-capitalist discourse ignores the entrepreneurialness of the state, of the newly formed republics. And I would argue that I would not consider the colonial infrastructures necessarily entrepreneurial. They were imperial, right? They were trying to extend the structures and the infrastructure of the empire to advance extraction, right? Once they were forced to leave the continent in the 1950s and 60s, of course, those modes were still left in place, but the management of that came to Ghana, Nigeria, Senegal to some degree, right? Guinea, problematically in Guinea, right? Where France removed as much infrastructure as they could upon decolonization. So I don't necessarily see what the colonizers were doing as entrepreneurial in the same way the projects of the Kosombo Dam or Ghana Atomic Energy Commission or the Tema Port construction are similarly entrepreneurial. There's a dozen other projects. Tanzania, many of the innovations that happened in Tanzania as well. Again, those were very entrepreneurial. And what maybe the young developers miss is that tradition of wedding liberation to both a material practice, right? Often what I would hear young entrepreneurs say things like, okay, we are now completing the final stage of liberation, economic liberation, right? When the anti-colonial movements were, explicitly about wresting the control of resources, wresting the control of wealth, wresting the system of wealth distribution away from colonizers, right? So it would be a mistake, and it's a fiction that shows sort of a paradox again of adopting this neoliberal California ideology of we're going to create a whole new economy and we're going to do it so much better than our elders did before us because we're not just being political. We are being, economically savvy and whatnot, right? Of course, every one of these post-colonial states was intensely aware that they needed to be entrepreneurial, that they needed to develop their economies, and they needed to redistribute the wealth in some kind of way, right? So that again, a challenge that and a blind spot for many of those who are valorizing the startup culture of California, thinking that this level of disruption is brand new in a Pan-Africanist trajectory. We should open it up for questions. Yeah. Genius.
Yeah, thank you so much. I want to ask about the activist developers. We see, for example, PayPal was not operated in Nigeria for about 2 decades. PayPal excluded Nigeria. But last month, PayPal partnered with another Nigerian fintech company called Paga to assess the market. And some persons are raising kind of, let's boycott PayPal, sort of. We shouldn't allow PayPal now.
Okay.
So considering this, how do you think the activist developers how do you think they should react to the capitalist the capitalist efforts to assess the markets currently, where there was histories of exclusion, histories of you can't do this, we can't work with you, we don't agree with your philosophy or what you want to achieve, or Pan-Africanism, but now they want to assess that market?
I think it's a really fascinating phenomenon, right? So this digital red line that existed primarily over Black Africa, right? Though some countries in Northern Africa also were excluded from access to Visa, Amazon shipping. Now we have mobile money, digital wallets, right? Again, the continent being the geolocation where there's been more bankless digital finance happening across the globe, right? The highest rates of person-to-person bankless electronic transfers since 2016, right? All of a sudden now we have interest, right? What I think is really interesting about that is while we cannot argue that commerce was happening, often the developmentalists would say, well, we need to harness the informal economy, right? And that's what digital wallets allowed many entrepreneurs and many communities to do. The visibility, the digitality, the indexableness of those transactions has now shown essentially new techno-colonialists ways to enter into the African continent, right? So that has to be said before open arms are made for PayPal or for Venmo or for Amazon or for any of these companies in order to enter the markets. I think that needs to be acknowledged, right? How do you design a protectionist a policy around that? I don't know where to begin, right? I'm not in policy, but I do think that policy needs to, a policy that would protect Pan-African sovereignty or African sovereignty would need to address that these tools come with their own systems and challenges, right? And right now they mostly seem colonial, right? Neo-colonial. Hello. Yeah.
Sorry, not a day goes by where I don't get a text, probably most recently from Amazon, saying there was a problem with your order, and then go to the site, and then they're asking for all this information that if it was really Amazon, they already have. Now I'm in America and I'm skeptical, and I mean, here are people they're new to tech, not necessarily developers, just folks in the community. How do you deal that? Especially, I mean, so much we know it's coming from not just the USA, coming from China, Russia, God knows where, and they're very sophisticated. And it's just so easy to get ripped off, and they also have access. If they've got your phone number, then they may have access to your banking already. Is there a way to even deal with that?
Yeah, I think the flip side of a kind of optimistic, techno-optimistic perspective on technology in the developing world, in the developing economies, I should say, is that crime is also a tactic, right, of development or wealth gathering, right? And unfortunately, the African continent has been over-identified with that kind of crime. 419 scams, Sakawa, and all kinds of cyber fraud, right? What I'm trying to highlight in the book, and I'm sorry, I don't really have how do we stop cyber fraud? How do we stop it? I think those questions are left to cybersecurity folks and policy folks, and I'm not a cybersecurity person. I think more access needs to be had, right? When we look at those maps and we look at the density of internet connections across the continent, we see unequal exchange digitized. and transported into the 21st century. So I think there needs to be more access rather than less access to Africa's internet. More communities need to be more have access to digital media on their terms.
Thank you very much. I'm Justina. I'm from Ghana, and
Thank you.
yes, I also kind of work within the STEM space. So most of the things that you were talking about, I'm very familiar,
Wonderful.
and it's actually very refreshing to learn how others learn about our country. The thing that probably I missed it a bit, and I'm glad you said that in 2018 you thought you were completed with this project, but then it kind of evolved by itself. Maybe something that you could also look at, especially looking at Pan-African Futurism, and within the tech space, it's women and the tech space.
Sure.
There's a lot of activism with trying to bring more women in the space. So in Ghana, for instance, we have young women who are building solar taxis and issues like that. So probably maybe something that you have not thought, that I think that is something that is really emerging on the African continent. And it's not just Ghana.
Yeah.
It's something that you could really bring it up, to bring it into such a space like this to really discuss, and it will be very interesting.
Yeah, thanks for that point. I think maybe some of these images, or maybe the identification of Pan-Africanism with male presidents, right, rather than people like Queen Mother Moore or Paula Murray or the Nardal sisters, right, means that when I'm talking about Pan-Africanism, I'm talking a kind of patriarchal nationalism that emerges from the continent. And that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a liberatory form of Pan-Africanism that started in the Caribbean, right, and that went out to African states, and that was adopted in the United States. A philosophy of Black unity and seeing one destiny around the Afro-descendants of the world, right? In the book, I talk quite a bit about women developers, right? One of the key ones that I profile in the book is, her name's Jamila Abdullahi. And in 2012, she was a grad student at SAIS in Johns Hopkins. She was born in Ghana, had lived in Nigeria, and was doing graduate work in the United States. When Ghana decides the hashtag campaign started, she flew back to Ghana and volunteered her time to this digital inclusion project, and was the face of the program, right, on YouTube and on social media. Right? She went on to start a blog that showed women entrepreneurs, that featured African development projects around the country. She got a job at the African Development Bank and started to host her own African development forums, independent of what she was doing for her job, with other African professionals involved in the development enterprise, right? She would go to the United Nations meeting or some sustainable development meeting. There'd be nothing but white Europeans or other people, foreigners, right, who deciding on what kind of projects need to happen on the continent, right, from a top-down approach. She pioneered this kind of horizontal and community-based approach to development activism using Google Hangouts, which at the time was kind of the Skype competitor, right, and just seen as video over the phone over the computer or whatever. And so she iterated on that technology use, and there are many developers like it. Soronko Solutions is a school and development firm run by women in Ghana. The head of the C3, which is a spinoff of Google, Google Fiber, high-speed urban fiber network, is the former country manager for Google, Estelle. I'm blanking on her last name right now, but she has been a key activist developer, systems builder of Ghana's internet for over 20 years, right? She started at Busy Internet. She was the manager at Busy Internet. Now she runs one of the largest fiber companies, urban fiber companies on the African continent, right? So women are very much part of this picture, and it's important to see them developed in the scene. At the same time, I will not, I I must acknowledge that there's also a lot of inherent sexism in the scene as emerges out of tech culture and as emerges out of a patriarchal society in general. But the work of women is integral. And I document that in the book, particularly the use of WhatsApp as a market tool for market women and any entrepreneur to develop additional sources of income. Women were key to that, and I document them in the book. So we have, do we have time for one more question? Okay, two more questions, one more question. Okay, I see two over here. Okay.
I was wondering, so you were mentioning how there's some connections in Africa, but not many. As that develops, I was wondering about when it comes to medical advancement and how that relates to the tech advancement we've been seeing. I know like in India, Uganda, and other parts of rural Africa and those rural areas, there's a lot of issues with things like diarrheal disease in children under 5, and also just not having access to enough doctors in the areas. And also just things, very preventable things like giving out oral rehydration solution for those kinds of diseases. And then also just better hygiene practices. And that comes through like education and like I was wondering if like the tech advancement could help out with that in supplying enough of those resources and also educating people who are in those really distant rural communities. And if we've been seeing that more in Ghana or, more overall.
Okay, great. Yes. Next question.
My name is Owen. Thank you for your talk. My question is, I guess it's a little bit similar. You mentioned that in a lot of countries on the continent, besides Ghana, that there isn't widespread internet adoption, and that poses a difficulty for African independence and autonomy in this digital age. And I'm wondering how, like, in your opinion, and how in your eyes, we can sort of walk that tightrope where African independence and African autonomy can be promoted while at the same time rejecting the paternalistic neocolonialism that like a lot of these, especially a lot of these companies like Amazon and PayPal seek to impose on Africa, where they only seek to use Africa's development for profit.
Okay, thank you. And then Professor Ayobade. Okay.
Yeah, congrats, Professor Royston. Started reading the book a few pages in, but it's really exciting. One of the things I appreciate about the book is it helps a number of us who are working on kind of contemporary African popular culture to think through kind of the reconciling of this neoliberal moment with an impulse towards Pan-Africanism, and many artists do it. And I think you give us a way to kind of thread through those lines of how do we make sense of these ostensibly paradoxical gestures and how artists kind of navigate those. Yeah. I do have a question about the different kind of paradox, right? A number of the individuals you reference in your talk are engineers who left Ghana, went to places like MIT, studied engineering, came back, and started coding with this. And you describe it as almost ideological conviction. And I wondered if you could talk us through what kind of intellectual genealogy do they draw on, right? Kwame Nkrumah is one of very few past presidents who were also intellectuals, yeah, right? Do they draw on Nkrumah's writings to kind of chart an intellectual genealogy for themselves? But how do they make that transition from STEM to quote-unquote activists? Yeah, right? That's, if you could help us think through that. And the other question really quick is, I know we talk about coders and we talk about engineers and these tech folks, and it seems to me as if artists are the cutting edge of what you describe as Pan-African Futurism, because African artists and cultural producers are doing precisely this thing and have built multi-billion-dollar industries, right? Innovating using technology. And I wondered if you could think out loud with us about what we might learn if we paid attention to what artists are doing, or Afrobeats musicians, which is, we've had conversations about Afrobeats over the last couple of years. But what do we learn if we paid attention to what artists are doing?
Thank you. And then Samir.
So my question kind of goes back to the banking system.
Yeah.
And so my I'm from Sudan, and sometimes, we transfer money to Sudan.
Sure.
And I was thinking, how do we make it easier to
Mhm.
make the kind of cross-border transfer much more sufficient? Because in here, I can Zelle, I can Venmo anyone across anyone in America, but like, especially in Africa and like rural area, it's very difficult to send money there.
Yep.
And if you're doing like a fundraise event or you're collecting money, sometimes the challenges is how are you going to send those money to the people down there who are in need? And that becomes a challenge. And it's often the case we'll send it to one person and that person will try to, distribute the money.
Sure.
But is there like a banking system or is it a government kind of regulation in a way that we can send out money and they can get it directly from the banks?
Okay, that's a big range of things. What I'll quickly say is not everywhere is linked with mobile money, right? It's very strong in Kenya, to some degree, Uganda, and in West Africa, right? And so other forms of mobile money that don't rely on banking institutions, rather rely on telecos, require a liberal teleco environment where maybe the government doesn't own the telco, right? And again, these are all managed by finance is managed by the government, right? So there's still national questions that have to be negotiated in this Pan-African mediascape, right? That said, if there's internet access, there's better access to transit. But there are still great opportunities using contextually and culturally relevant digital media, right? And that would be purely SMS exchange, right? Not relying on high-speed broadband internet, right? And SMS-based financial apps have been the game changer, right? They were iterated out of a paper iteration of phone credits, right? Anyways, I talk about that in the book. It's uneven, but there are possibilities when thinking locally. And to the young woman's question about medical innovations in particular, I would say rural populations, again, have a different media ecology. Often people are relying on radio and all the kind of attendant technologies of radio. So line of sight towers, even Bluetooth exchange becomes a local kind of internet. And then you have mesh systems that can be established through mobile phones that are removed from cell towers and broadband. So in those places, if people are using those technologies that people are already using, right? In the Ebola crisis, for instance, radio and music was more effective than tweets, right? To both spread information and also spread practices that people can use to prevent from getting infected. So each community, when thinking about, let's either developmentally or technologically about what works and what should work, you have to focus on the ecology that's already existing in there, right? Brother Dotun, Professor Ayobade, we've talked so much about cultural production. And my chapter, Afropolitan Mediascapes, where I take up this problematic term, Afropolitan, and apply it not necessarily to people, but to the digital media and technology itself. Afrobeats, Nollywood, very much a prototype for what I call Pan-African Futurism, right? Whereas Pan-African Futurism focused on ICT development or developmental outcomes, right, are very explicit about economic or capacity building, right? Capacity is already there and been built through musical enterprise, right? From Lagos to London to Houston, right? We see these circuits that have been energized by culture, by artists, by music, by film. In many ways, that is what I would call Pan-African Futurism. My focus here and my ideas developed out of an analysis of ICT for D literature, thinking about development, thinking about technology and national development and wealth building, but that was already happening organically in the field of culture. And so absolutely, that chapter is very much a cultural studies reading of what I call Afropolitan media. And in that Afropolitan media, I see both a Pan-Africanist impulse politically and a desire to move beyond class divides, which music and film do very well. Thank you.